informal way back here behind the podium, but otherwise I can't operate the slide projector. So this way I can fire the slides at the same time. Yeah, as Todd mentioned, I started off in journalism, I can't really believe it, but like 2 decades ago, out in KQED in San Francisco, and I was an intern out there. That's how I got into doing journalism. I'm an English major. I didn't actually ever study journalism, so if you're thinking about journalism and you're not in a journalism major or something like that, there are a lot of people who are not. I was thinking a bit about what I wanted to talk about tonight, and I've spent about the last decade covering the developing world for the most part. I went to Africa in 2002 as NPR's Africa correspondent. I was there for 4 years. Then I had this Knight Wallace Fellowship at the University of Michigan, looking at the relationship between the developed and the developing world. And then was based in Mexico, covering mainly Mexico, but also might be included the Caribbean and Central America at that point in time. And at NPR, oftentimes you will get, if you're on the foreign desk, you'll often get pulled into other things. So during the Arab Spring, I went to Egypt pretty much just to help out because our people there were so overburdened with trying to cover the Arab Spring as that started to unfold. So I went to pretty much allow some people to go on vacation for a little while. And then I also ended up covering the tsunami, earthquake, nuclear disaster in Japan in 2011. And I covered Sri Lanka, although obviously that tsunami spread throughout that entire region. So I was thinking about today what I was hoping to talk about. I wanted to talk about globalization. And it's a very controversial subject at times, but what I've sort of come to realize through my work and through the reporting that I do is just how interconnected our world has become, for better or for worse. Whether you think it's a good thing, whether you think it's a bad thing, it struck me that it's just become inevitable. And the effects of it are often not what you might expect. And so I want to start off looking at a trip I did to Nigeria last fall. This was in October, November, I can't remember exactly, but it was last fall. And I went to this place in northern Nigeria where they're having a terrible problem with lead poisoning. And what's so strange about this story is that this disaster, this environmental disaster that was occurring in northern Nigeria and killing children and causing unheard of levels of lead poisoning was driven by the international price of gold. And over the last decade or so, the international price of gold has steadily increased, and it's been at record levels. I think it's sort of backed off a bit lately. And it seems like, what would the international price of gold have to do with people who are living in communities that don't even have electricity, that are in this really incredibly remote area? Well, as that price of gold increased, gold in these hills, which were really marginal gold deposits, all of a sudden became profitable. And people could make $40 a day, $50 a day, if they were lucky, mining gold in this part of Nigeria. The problem with that was that this gold happened to be in deposits interlaid with deposits of lead. And because the mining methods are incredibly crude there, as they were processing the gold, lead was released into the atmosphere, and it caused this environmental disaster. These are the machines that they were using to crush, that they continue to use to crush the ore. And basically what they do is they would get big burlap bags full of communities. And these they have now moved out of the actual villages and out of the actual settlements. The settlements are these mud, basically compounds with mud walls. You go inside the compound. I wasn't actually allowed in. It's a Muslim community, and outside men wouldn't be allowed inside the compound. But it was described to me, and basically you could see it from the outside. It's these mud walls that would mark off the entire compound, and then inside there would be mud huts, basically. And they were because people were worried about other people getting their gold ore. They were doing all of the processing inside their compounds originally, and this led to this incredible epidemic of lead poisoning, in which more than 400 kids died. Many kids were severely disabled as a result, mentally disabled, developmentally disabled as a result of severe lead poisoning. And at first it wasn't even clear what was causing this. And Doctors Without Borders was working in the region, and they started to see these kids coming in. They would be spasming, they couldn't figure out what it was that was affecting it. They thought maybe it was hemorrhagic fever, some new superbug. They had no idea what was causing these kids to just sometimes just die right inside the clinics. And they actually called in the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, and they sent some people in, and they were the ones that figured out that it was actually lead in the environment. And it was at a level that they had never seen before. These investigators had never seen before. And again, part of what's interesting is that this wouldn't have happened if the international price of gold hadn't gone to really sort of incredibly high levels in the last over the last decade. And it was driven by that people started mining this. And this is one of the villages that actually is still waiting to be remediated to deal with this, to get the lead out of the environment. They basically come in and they bulldoze all the houses. They scoop about 5 inches of the topsoil. They dump it in a big pit. They cover it up and they start over. And the cost of doing that is far greater than any of the profits that these guys have managed to reap by selling this. And the Nigerian government, in this town in particular, has been holding up the money to have this done. Supposedly it was released recently, and this town was also supposed to get this remediation fairly soon. But part of the problem was that Doctors Without Borders didn't want to treat, it actually just didn't work to treat the kids who were incredibly sick and then send them back into an environment that was completely laden with lead. It just medically didn't work. So they were only treating the sickest of the sick in this town. Anyway, it's a very interesting example of how interconnected this tiny little town in northern Nigeria is with international markets around the world. And now that this has happened, also we're starting to see these companies coming in and just claiming that they own all of the land in this area. And that was leading to a lot of tension. This sign, I'm not sure if you can read it, but it says this land belongs to this company, and unauthorized persons are not allowed, and you are warned. And, so it's not even just the medical aspects of this rise in the gold price. You're also getting all of this tension there over who actually owns the land. And one thing that I thought was very interesting is that one of the ways to deal with this problem of the lead being dispersed was to use a different type of mining, different type of processing that is called wet processing. And as opposed to these flour mills that just allow the dust to go everywhere, everything's sort of underwater, and the process just has water running into a different type of mill. And it was the Chinese who actually brought this in. And it was Chinese gold Chinese claimed that they were doing this in an effort to harvest the lead and that they weren't really interested in the gold, but it was very clear that they were buying the gold. And but again, this little tiny town in northern Nigeria, you have forces from China coming in to buy the gold. You've got investigators from the CDC in Atlanta. You've got French doctors from Doctors Without Borders, all ending up converging to deal with or exploit this situation in different ways. This is my good friend and the photographer who went with me. That's David Gilkey, and he's going down to actually check out one of these mines, and they are just pits dug by hand, just straight down in there. You look down, you couldn't even see the bottom, and there was guys working down there by hand, excavating this ore. This is, I'm switching now over to polio. On this same trip that we went to Nigeria on, we also spent some time looking at polio eradication. And I think polio eradication is actually a really fascinating topic, in part because it gets at the possibilities, the great possibilities of what humanity could accomplish around the globe, and very well might accomplish, wiping out an awful disease, a terrible disease. Polio used to be that there were hundreds of thousands of cases of polio around the world each year, including in the United States. It caused paralysis. People would end up spending the rest of their lives living in iron lungs. It can be fatal. It could cause various types of paralysis that might not be that severe, but people might lose use of part of their bodies. This child here is one of the 223 kids last year around the globe who suffered from polio. And that is the lowest number of new polio cases ever recorded in history. It dropped from 650 in 2011 down to 223 last year. And the great hope is that polio, through the brute force of medical science and through the world really coming together in a very interesting way, could be wiped out. Smallpox is the only other human disease that's ever been wiped off the planet. And smallpox was a far easier disease to attack. First of all, the vaccine didn't need to be refrigerated. There's not a huge pool. I believe actually in smallpox there's no sort of latent cases, asymptomatic cases. Either people have it or they don't. With polio, you have huge pools of people who are carriers of polio but show no symptoms, and thus it's very hard to sort of isolate where it is. So polio is a far more difficult disease to actually attack, and it actually looks like this might get pulled off. Unfortunately, the three areas where we're still seeing polio transmission is northern Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And the Afghanistan-Pakistan cases are pretty much in the same area along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And it's in an area of conflict. And this part of northern Nigeria also is an area of conflict. Boko Haram is an extremist Islamist group that's operating up there that's vowed to try to bring down the Nigerian government. There's regularly attacks on both foreigners and on Christians in the area. And just in February, 9 polio vaccinators in this town were assassinated. So even as the world is getting incredibly close to wiping out this disease, and the only way to really wipe it out is to make sure that vaccination rates in areas where there continues to be transmission occur. So those vaccine campaigns have to go for it. It's the only way that it's really going to work. And moment, really billions of dollars actually being poured into this effort. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has gotten behind it. But it's the type of thing that if it could be accomplished, it actually would, I think, be inspiring on many other diseases that could really look at it, okay, this really could be done, this can be accomplished. I think that actually a failure on polio would be a huge setback. And it's just, what I find so interesting about the polio eradication effort is that it's like, if humanity sets goals, can it accomplish them? And what are the types of goals that people would like to see accomplished? And certainly wiping out disease and eliminating disease seems like it should be one of them. So this was unfortunately, this child had not been vaccinated, and he got polio in what was last summer. And so on the one hand, it is quite terrible, but at the same time, it's a symbol of how far things have gone, that there are only 223 cases in all of last year. Scroll on to the next one. No. So this is, I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story. So I'm heading off to Nigeria, and my kids have just got way too much stuff. And they've got a lot of stuff that they don't even play with anymore. And so I was about to go, and I said, you guys, I want you to take this suitcase, and I want you to go fill it with all those stuffed animals you got lying around that you guys never play with, that you don't care about anymore. Fill it up, and I'm going to bring this thing to Nigeria. And they sort of complained a bit, but eventually they did. And they filled this suitcase, which you can see down there, with all these different stuffed animals. And this is the father of the kid with polio. So I gave this father this suitcase full of stuff. But to reach this man, I had to hook up with some people from UNICEF, and then we went by sort of the main council for the town, and by the time we arrived at this guy's house, it was like 3 SUVs full of officials and people from various, it was kind of a nightmare as a journalist. So like, you really did not want to have all these people. And part of what I find so interesting about this story is that I gave him this thing. And as soon as I gave this to him, all of the town officials decided that he should only have one of the dogs. And so the child with polio got one dog, and all the rest of this stuff ended up getting divided up in the various other SUVs that had arrived at the scene. And I thought it was somewhat indicative of what often happens when things arrive into a place like this. There's often a divvying up of the spoils, and that's certainly what happened in that case. This is a guy also in this same town in Kano in northern Nigeria, and he had polio as a kid, and he builds these sort of basically almost like training wheels to go on the scooters. And this is his there, and he's very proud of them, and he has quite good mobility, but one of the things that I found really amazing, I don't know, it struck me talking to this guy, was he said that he always regretted that he was never able to play soccer or join the police force, and that because his legs were crippled. This is an area right by a river where all of the garbage was getting dumped in, and they were actually taking sewage samples. They take samples of the sewage and actually check for polio in the environment to see whether there's actually any virus moving in the environment there. And that's something that's fairly new, and it's part of the overall, this was never happening before, and it allows the vaccinators to be sort of deployed into areas where before there actually are any cases, they will say, look, it looks like we're getting a whole bunch of virus in this area. We should go in and make sure that the vaccination campaigns are going sort of full bore. And this actually happened last year in Cairo. Similar sampling of just the waste found that there was polio virus circulating in Cairo, and before anyone actually ended up getting polio, or a paralytic case of polio, some people may have actually contracted it, but there was no paralysis, they upped the vaccinations again, and hopefully it's through techniques like that, new techniques like that, that they're going to be able to make sure that the virus can actually be wiped out. So now we're moving over to Haiti. And this photo is actually just from earlier this year in January. I was there. You've still got buildings that are sort of teetering from the earthquake 3 years ago. Haiti is an incredibly complicated place. I feel like I had a good fortune of having been there before the earthquake hit Port-au-Prince, in part because that gave me something of a perspective. It's a very chaotic place. It's a place where things are difficult to do even in the best of times. So to see it before the earthquake, then to see the earthquake hit it, and then to be there I probably was there 12 times in that year after the earthquake hit Port-au-Prince. I think I had a somewhat better perspective just because I had been there before. But it is a place where sort of the good intentions of the first world and the developed world often just don't really accomplish what they're intended to do. Despite the fact that billions of dollars have been poured into Haiti, even before the earthquake, in development, it remains the poorest country in the hemisphere. This is the main cathedral in Port-au-Prince, which still, this is just from last year, still hasn't been rebuilt. From the other side, this is actually from not this January, but the January before, because you can see that I can tell that the presidential palace is still standing in the background. But even now, hundreds of thousands of people, 3 years after the earthquake, continue to live in these types of conditions, just in tents that are torn, that are ripped, that you can even see that these are electric lines running. That line that goes across there, people have just sort of strung electric lines through the camps. And this, in some way, is so depressing because the U.S. government, the French government, the UN all pledged that they were going to address this. It was like the world came forward and said, we're going to do something about this. And you go back 3 years later, and really, not much has been accomplished. You don't go in and see large-scale new housing projects. You see some temporary shelters which have become permanent settlements. You still see a lot of people just living under tarps. Again, the Chinese are also very much involved there in terms of donations. This was something that I thought was a real ray of hope. It was Paul Farmer's organization, Partners in Health, had decided that they were going to build a teaching hospital outside of Port-au-Prince. So that one of the big problems during the earthquake is that Port-au-Prince was so overcrowded that when the earthquake hit, a lot of people were living in really substandard housing. Almost everyone says that city had just become completely overcrowded. So Paul Farmer's group said they're going to build this huge teaching hospital. This was in 2012. This photo is from 2012. Just after this, they had a grand opening. I did a big story on it in 2012, just before the grand opening, and then it never opened. things, even when the world completely focuses its attention right after the earthquake on Haiti, it was not a success. It didn't accomplish what the international community said they wanted to accomplish, or what the Haitians hoped it would accomplish. This is President Michel Martelly. This is from this last trip that I did in January. And I also found this interesting. He called a press conference right before the 3rd anniversary of the quake. And he did it in 2 phases. He had a press conference for the local press in Creole, and then he was having a press conference for the international press. You know, CNN had been there right after the quake saying how they were going to stand by Haiti. There was me and NBC News were the only 2 American news organizations that had sent anybody to Haiti on the 3rd anniversary of the quake. So 3 years later, the attention had just completely fizzled. The AP has somebody based there, so they were there. Reuters has somebody based there, so they were there. And then there was some Venezuelan press, people from Brazil, but in terms of American press that actually bothered to send anyone, it was just me and a crew from NBC News. And during this press conference, President Michel Martelly said, "Stop sending aid to Haiti." He said, "The system is broken. Until we fix it, we should just stop this entire thing." This is a country which has been receiving billions of dollars in aid. He's saying that he doesn't have control over the aid, that it's going to aid groups, and they all have these diverse agendas where they're doing whatever they want, that there's no coordination, there's no focus. But to hear the president of a country say that, I found just incredibly surprising. He's also an incredibly interesting guy. He used to be a very popular Haitian musician, went by the name Sweet Mickey. He was a compa singer. Compa is this Haitian brand of music, which is very, very Caribbean, very lively, very fun, party music, a little bit sort of raw in a way. So he does come from a different perspective, a different background, but still, to hear a president of a country say that, I just found amazing. The other thing we found amazing, this is again my friend David, our photographer from NPR. Haiti is currently trying to promote tourism in the country. And what's really amazing is that they don't have the infrastructure to really do tourism. I mean, the U.S. Embassy pretty much warns people not to come. I mean, if you look on the website, they're just like, there are incidents of kidnapping, infrastructure isn't really there, and it's kind of true. I mean, I wouldn't sort of just encourage people to just fly in there without some sense of some support, some organization to work with. However, in the north, you have Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines has, on their website, marketed this site that they go to in Haiti as an island in the Caribbean, despite the fact that they've just walled it off with fence, and it's part of Haiti, near Cape Haitian on the north coast. And so you drive through these roads that are, it took us like 45 minutes to go, I don't know, just like 3 or 4 miles out of Cape Haitian. The road was absolutely terrible. I mean, you're through, you feel like you're out in like one of the least developed countries in the world. And then you get to the top of this hill, and just to the right of David there is a roller coaster, and down there is the largest cruise ship in the world, docked in the harbor, which, despite the fact that they're saying that they're taking people to a Caribbean island, it's part of Haiti, and it's all behind this fence. And you can go down here to the next one. And so that fence, you are sort of the taxis which take locals out to the various villages around there. But this scene was just such an amazing collision of two worlds that I had to get some photos of. Also in the north at the moment, there's been one of the biggest projects to come out of all of the U.S. development aid to Haiti post-earthquake. The biggest project that has been built is an industrial park in the north making t-shirts, and it's being funded by USAID. And it's very interesting. They put in a power plant, they put in their own sewage systems, they built roads, they built big, sort of huge, modern, but really large tin factories that were quite nice. They were cool, they were well lit. They pay about $5 a day, and they're making t-shirts for Kmart and Kohl's department stores. And for people in the area, these were considered good jobs, $5 a day. But it's an interesting question. I mean, is that what? And I don't actually have the answer to whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing. I unfortunately have seen and heard exactly the same argument elsewhere in the world. When I was in Southern Africa, there was a certain law in place that was allowing some of the Southern African countries to export textiles to the U.S. duty-free. And these factories shot up in Lesotho and Swaziland, which are small, tiny nations inside South Africa, and big garment factories developed there. And, they were pumping out garments, they were providing employment. The backers of the factory said, this is the beginning of an industrial phase for these countries. It'll allow these people to gain skills, and eventually they'll move on from making t-shirts to making Italian-type suits, and they'll move on to doing other things. Well, a couple of years later, that law was lifted on basically it allowed other places in the world to also have the same duty-free status of moving garments into the United States, and all of those factories just disappeared from Lesotho and Swaziland. And there was no sort of legacy of an industrial process that was moving forward, or skills that were being applied to more higher-end garments or things like that. So I'm quite skeptical about whether this project in Haiti is actually going to work, whether it's going to lead to anything more than jobs that are paying $5 a day. This is just a shot of where, right after the earthquake, David and I were staying in this hotel, and again on this last trip, just in January, we were back at exactly the same hotel, and this is where we had rented a room that we were using as an office, but now they have completely demolished it, and so he's standing where we used to file our stories from during the actual earthquake. So I'm moving on now to, I should have gotten a watch in front of me. How much time we've gone through?
It's about 7:45 right now.
All right, I'm going to go sort of quickly through this last segment that I had on Moldova and tuberculosis, because I wanted to leave time for questions. So I'll try to go through this relatively quickly. This is Pavel and Oksana. They didn't want their photos taken. He has drug-resistant tuberculosis, what's called extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis. She had TB and has been cured of it, and they actually met in a TB hospital in Moldova and got married. They just had a new baby born. When this photo was taken about a month before, they're attempting to move forward, but incurable. And again, what I find interesting about this from a global context is that he could be cured if he was in the United States, but the drugs that are available in Moldova and are available in most parts of the world simply don't work on the type of TB he has. There's a new drug that has hit the market called adactylin, and it's actually quite new. But if he was in the United States, he probably could be cured. His doctors don't think he has much of a chance. This is what he's currently taking. He takes about 24 pills a day. These pills are incredibly toxic. He lives inside this is a Soviet-era hospital it's the second largest city in Moldova. It's called Valsk, but the hospital was built under the Soviets. There's very little, it's just a TV in their room. This is the outside of the hospital's sort of falling in. This is the doctor for Pavel, and he described Pavel's tuberculosis as an incurable infectious cancer. So not only does he have a disease that probably is going to kill him, he also is infectious. And so now he has a new child. He has to always be wearing a mask when he's around the child. Even doing that, there's concern that he could pass this strain of TB onto his son. This is another guy in a separate TB hospital. Part of what I found interesting about him was Moldova has, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, Moldova has struggled to figure out where it exists in the world. It's a former Soviet republic. It used to be part of Romania before World War II. It's gone back and forth between looking at trying to be tied into the European Union or trying to solidify its ties with Moscow. And workers in Moldova, for the most part, do the same thing. They tend to go off to work in Russia. They tend to go off to work in the European Union. And a lot of those workers are actually spreading TB all over the place because TB takes 6 months to cure, even if you've got the simplest form of it. So what's happening, and why the problem is so bad in Moldova, is because their economy is terrible and people can't stay at home because there's no work in Moldova. So they get TB, they can't take 6 months to just stay there and get treated. So they have to go off to Russia to get work. And in the process, they give up on their treatment. Their form of TB becomes drug resistant. They then spread it to other people who they're staying with in these huge sort of flop houses in Moscow. More people get it. They come back to Moldova when they're out of work. It's a disaster. And some of the forms are completely incurable. So it's an interesting example of the tie-in of economics and migration and disease throughout that part of the world. And there's no reason, and there was actually a guy who was picked up by the U.S. Border Patrol crossing into Texas, I think while I was in Moldova, so like in late February, and he came from Nepal, and he had extensively drug-resistant TB. So we don't have hardly any TB in the United States. I think it's about 9,000 cases a year, which is really quite low. But there's no reason that the same stuff couldn't be ending up here. And one of the other things that's just so awful about drug-resistant TB is that many of the people who are being treated go completely deaf. Well, it's not many. It's about 25% completely lose their hearing. This woman, Maria, she was a singer in people told me that it was a fairly popular choir in this town of Valsk, and she was being treated for TB, but she was losing her hearing and could no longer sing. So just incredible tragedy of someone losing the thing that they really loved as a result of this disease. The rest of my photos kind of go into Libya and to the Arab Spring, and so I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions at this point. And feel free to, on this type of stuff that I was talking about, or if you're interested in working at NPR, or the journalism aspect, I'm happy to take questions on just about anything. So, you know, to some degree, I've heard about this story through CDC. I was actually at the CDC in Atlanta, and I was meeting with some people, and they were told me this story about how they had gone to investigate this, and so that's where I first heard about it. But Doctors Without Borders eventually was, you know, in some way using me. They wanted more publicity about this to get that political pressure onto the Nigerian government to actually pay for that remediation. So, you know, it was coming through that type of pressure, and it was sort of being driven very much by Doctors Without Borders. They were really, I think if they hadn't been there, I really don't know what would have happened. I think you just would have had a lot more kids dying and being stunted and made severely ill by this environmental contamination. Yeah.
I was wondering, with the polio and tuberculosis, very completely opposite outcome. Why is that? And what do you think about prevention versus treatment? And then really learn anything from polio and apply that to tuberculosis.
The problem with tuberculosis is that it's so widespread that the world is not close to being able to contain it. Secondly, all attempts at developing a vaccine for tuberculosis have pretty much failed. I mean, there's still things going on to try to develop a vaccine, but none of the vaccines have really been effective. They've had like 30% efficacy. So that's really the reason that there's such a divergence with tuberculosis getting worse and worse. Overall, TB cases are pretty much steady. It's pretty much staying flat. The problem is that more and more of them are drug-resistant cases that are much harder to treat or impossible to treat. Yeah, and TB is also a really interesting disease. It like in the United States at the moment, the worst TB problem is on Skid Row in Los Angeles. It's almost like TB is like a magnet that is attracted to places where people are really poor, where people have it actually is it's quite true. It affects people whose immune systems are compromised. It affects people who don't have good nutrition. It affects people who are drug addicts and alcoholics. If your body's system is, and it's really interesting, talking to doctors, they say, oh, you can only get it if you have repeated exposure to people who are sick. And I'm like, no, that's kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, it's a bacteria. It floats through the air. They cough. It goes into the air. I inhale it. I mean, why would it be that I have to have repeated exposure? But that is sort of how that seems to be the way that it spreads. That the very first time you get exposed to it, you probably won't get it. So it tends to concentrate in areas of people who are already socially on the margins, people in prisons. AIDS has also had a big impact of the resurgence of TB, particularly in Africa, that people have they're immune compromised and they're much more susceptible to picking it up. So in terms of, you asked about just overall prevention, it can be prevented, but it often is spreading in environments like homeless shelters, like prisons, among people who are on the margins of society. It's always harder to put in place preventative measures among people who've got so many other issues and problems that they're dealing with. Yeah.
You had mentioned the command model was in the United States. You could probably
approval of this drug. So at the moment, it's not available anywhere outside the United States. And that isn't for any other reason than it just hasn't gone through the process. It also is extremely expensive. One guy I talked to with the TB Alliance said that it would probably cost, if a case like this, if Pavel showed up in the United States, it would probably cost $500,000 to cure it. Part of that is that you would have it in isolation in a medical facility, but yeah, we're talking huge amounts of money. To cure somebody of traditional TB in Moldova, it costs about $100 just for the medicine, just for the straight medicine. The medicine for someone with drug-resistant TB, not the type that Pavel has, but sort of a stage before him, that is still curable, costs about, I think it was $5,000 just for the drugs for someone who has that form of TB. When this ends up being a huge burden on health systems that are already really pushed to the limit. So this disease, which can just spread quite easily through the air, it's a huge problem, particularly in a lot of the former Soviet republics. And that seems to be driven by, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a real breakdown in the healthcare systems there, and people were being treated improperly for TB on sort of a widespread scale. A lot of people were getting drugs that were not appropriate, and thus you got a lot of drug resistance that developed in that entire Eastern Europe, former Soviet bloc area of the world. Anyone else? Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about how your assignments are developed? Are you pitching stories? Are you being sent?
It varies quite a bit. I had a lot more freedom. When I was just covering Africa, I could just say, I want to go to this, and that, to some degree, reflected the fact that there was not that much interest in Washington, and if I was coming up with stuff, they were perfectly happy with whatever I came up with. I find on the covering global health, it's probably, I meet with my editors about half the time I'm doing what they want me to do, half the time I'm doing what I'm proposing. It's much more driven by the editors saying, we think we should be getting more on, like, at the moment, they're quite interested in dengue. There's been a lot more dengue fever cropping up around the world, including down in Florida. So we're going to try to do some stuff on dengue next. Yeah, this new job is based in Washington, and NPR is in Washington. So there's far more need for me to be collaborative with my editors. When I was based in Mexico City or based in Johannesburg, there was a lot more autonomy. You were very much working on your own, which had benefits and its drawbacks. But yeah, that's kind of how it's worked for me. Yeah, at NPR. Yeah.
Say something about working in Mexico City. I mean, you keep mentioning it sort of casually. I mean, living in Mexico City, that's life-threatening. And so, that situation seems so severe over the last, I've forgotten how many years. Someone who actually did some plan work on that back in Mexico.
The thing is, Mexico City itself always felt like an oasis after being out in other parts of Mexico. Like, Mexico City really, it's a big city, 20 million people, you have all the crime that you would normally get, but you were not getting the drug violence that you were getting in a lot of the other places. And I would go off to report in various parts of Mexico and be very happy to get back to Mexico City. So, as a place to live, Mexico City, I really liked it. It still suffered from some of the fundamental problems that are plaguing Mexico, and that is that there basically is no rule of law. Like, there's no, I'll give an example. My wife was in traffic at one point, and she saw this man beating his wife in the car. And traffic in Mexico City is like terrible. It's just like you're crawling along. It's like you're practically living with people, right? You're like, sometimes you give up on traffic. You like turn around and just go home because you weren't getting where you're going. So she's crawling along in traffic, and this guy in a car turns and looks at her, and she like yells something at him. He gets out of the car, smashes his fist through the passenger side window. Now, fortunately, my wife is a bit of a dog fanatic, and she has this pit bull thing. And the pit bull just jumps at this guy. But doesn't jump out of the car, fortunately. And so he backs off and gets back in his car, and he drives up on the sidewalk and drives off. And she gets down his license plate, and so, I mean, our window is smashed in, which is going to cost us whatever that's going to be to fix. All of our Mexican friends said, don't call the police, don't get involved in this. Jenny's like, well, you know, this guy could kill his wife tonight. All of our Mexican friends said, don't go there. Do not go to the authorities on this. Pay to get your window fixed yourself, forget about it. And that is the problem in Mexico, that the insecurity you feel is that you're on your own. You